Hi guys, in this episode of Edit My Image, it's a battle between Lightroom and Photoshop. Feel free to follow along this tutorial from start to finish, or you can use the chapter links below to allow you to skip through, but you won't want to, it's all good, trust me. If you enjoy this video, I would love it if you could subscribe to my channel, and that way you'll never miss any of my pet photography editing tutorials in Lightroom and Photoshop. Hi, I'm Charlotte Reeves from Learn Pet Photography, and you've tuned into episode 4 of my series, Edit My Photo. So I actually run these monthly challenges in my Real Shoots Complete Course private Facebook group. I'm just going to leave a link to this course below so you can go check that out if you're interested in joining us. So in this challenge, I handed over the raw image of one of my favorite dog and owner photos. This is Tara and Jet enjoying a twilight wander along the beach on the Gold Coast. This was taken a few years ago. So out of all the many submissions that I received from all the members of the Real Shoots Complete Course Facebook group, I chose Tiffany's edit because she managed to bring all those hidden pastel tones out from the raw file that were present, and also managed to keep natural skin tones as well. And that's not an easy feat. So as the winner of the challenge, Tiffany submitted this image to me to edit. So I know Tiffany is actually a really great photographer, so I actually asked her to give me one that was a little bit tricky so I could demonstrate something cool for you guys. So the first thing that we need to deal with in this image is obviously brightening it all up, and we're going to use that using global adjustments in Lightroom. Then I'm going to be giving you guys a couple of different tools that you can add to your editing box of tricks. I'll be demonstrating 2 different ways that you can add flare or haze in an image. So whenever you're creating flare, it does have to be done quite carefully, and you have to really pay attention to where the light is coming from in the image, because it can actually look fake if you choose the wrong image to do it on, or if you do it in such a way that it doesn't look realistic. But I thought this shot was actually the perfect candidate for demonstrating something like this, so thanks Tiffany. So make sure you watch all the way to the end. There is a cool little speed edit, and I will be sharing the final images created using the different techniques, and so you can tell me which one you prefer and why. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you in the comments this time around. So without further ado, let's dive into the edit. So this image definitely needs some brightening up. Looking at the histogram, you can see that it's definitely a bit underexposed. I'm assuming Tiffany exposed it so she could retain detail in the highlights. There are some highlights over on the right hand side here. If I were to crop that section out, watch the histogram change, and now basically we have no data at the top end of the histogram, so basically all that is gone. Now if she were to expose this instead, a little bit more so the tones are in the middle, she probably would have lost those tones over on the right hand side. I guess it sort of depends, do you really need those tones there? Does it matter if they're blown out, if the rest of the image is good? So what we really need to achieve with this image is just brightening it up, bringing out some of the colors that I know that are lurking in there, and get it looking a lot happier. So first of all, I'm going to take those shadows up quite a way. We're also going to take the exposure up a little bit, because moving all those tones up to a higher area in the histogram is going to involve some pretty heavy lifting. So I am actually going to use the exposure slider there a little bit just to get those tones a bit brighter. Now it's also looking a little bit cool, so I'm going to take the temperature up, because I really want to bring out some of those lovely warm tones in the dog's coat and in the dog's eyes as well. There's some lovely chocolate drop eyes lurking there. In order to try and retain some of those bright highlights over on the right hand side, I'm taking that highlight slider down, and you'll see that spike at the top end of the histogram just kind of get squished down a little bit into a more manageable sort of shape. So I'm just going to go through and do a bit more tweaking here. Basically I'm trying to brighten, not lose detail in the highlights, bring back detail to the shadowed areas, and just get it looking a bit more lively. I'm going to take the clarity up, the vibrance up, a little bit green, take the magenta up. I think it's looking a lot better than it was. Take that warmth up even more. Because, I mean, we do have some bright sunshine sort of spilling over from the right hand side, and there is just a bit of a touch of backlight hitting the back of the dog as well. So we've got a bit of an edge around here that's acting as a bit of a rim light on the fur of the dog. Now, I would just like to take this moment to say that this was shot with a 35mm prime lens. It was shot at f1.8, and Tiffany's done really well with the focus. So the focus is bang on the eyeballs. They're super sharp. Couldn't have done better with the focus there. So I think that's looking a lot better. Definitely made it look a little bit brighter and a bit more vibrant. I think that's pretty good. So in order to deal with this area over on the right hand side, something that I do like to do with areas of sky that are completely blown out is actually embrace that and add some sun flare. So add a bit of an area of haze, warmth, to kind of give the impression of sunlight spilling over through the background from behind onto the back of the dog. So there's a couple of different ways we can achieve this, and I'm going to show you two different ways, one in Photoshop and one in Lightroom. So to do the two different edits, I'm actually going to create a virtual copy. So down here on the film strip, I'm going to right click on the thumbnail and select create virtual copy. For the first copy, I'm going to do the flare effect in Lightroom, and that basically involves using a radial filter. So I'm just going to reset all the effects here by double clicking on the effect word. So that sets all those sliders back to 0. Now I'm just going to draw a circle basically up in this top corner. I want it to kind of look like it's coming from that top right hand corner. I'm going to have to invert that as well, so that it only applies to that section and doesn't apply to the rest of the image. So I kind of think I want it about this kind of shape. Now, it is spilling over a little bit onto the dog, so if I do show the mask overlay here, it's actually giving us an idea of exactly where it's going to apply that effect. Now, what I'm going to do is apply the effect first, and then we're going to brush that back off the dog. So what is the effect? Okay, here we go. So we want to increase the exposure a little. We want it to make it really nice and sunlit and flary. I'm going to take the dehaze slider to the left, which is in essentially dehazing it, which is essentially hazing it. So I'm going to take that to the left, and it gives that really flared out kind of look. I'm going to take the contrast right down. That helps to also, because when you think about a flared out image, it's an image that's basically lacking in contrast. So taking that contrast down is sort of being true to that flared out look. So taking that right down. And I've actually found I can take the exposure down a little bit too, because those two other effects are kind of having that same effect as if I would have taken the exposure up. So I'm taking the exposure down a little bit. I also want to make it look nice and sunlit as well. So I'm going to change the color temperature. So the temperature can go up, and also the tint can go up a little bit as well, because it can err a little bit on the side of magenta rather than green. So let's just take that tint up as well to give it a little bit of a pinkish kind of hue. Okay, so I'm just going to turn that off and on so you can see the difference there. So it's giving that area a real nice sunshiny kind of effect. Now I'm going to take the highlights down a bit to try and recover some of that detail in the sky there. It is lurking there in the raw file. I'm going to take the clarity down as well, because that will help soften the area. I'll take the clarity down. I don't want to take it down too far because it'll start looking fake and start, drawing your attention to that area of the image a bit too much. I take dehaze down just a little bit more. Often it's just sort of tweaking settings. I'm going to take the shadows up because that will also help with reducing contrast. So let me turn that off and on again. Yeah. I think that looks pretty good. If this piece of grass is bothering anyone else, don't worry, I'm going to remove it, but I'm just not going to do it in Lightroom. I'm going to wait until I get into Photoshop to do that. So it's coming, it's coming. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. So now it's time to actually brush that effect off the dog. I'm just switching to my Wacom tablet here for better control over what I'm doing. I always like to switch to the Wacom if I'm going to be using a brush, because that sort of gives me a bit more fine control. Otherwise, I just use the mouse if I'm in Lightroom. So while I've got that radial adjustment selected, I'm going to switch to brush just by clicking brush, and then switch to erase by clicking erase. I'm going to make sure auto mask is ticked, and I'm just going to go in here and just carefully brush this effect off the dog, because we don't want it spilling over onto the front of the dog, because that just doesn't make sense. So it doesn't matter if it's right on the edges of the fur, because that kind of does make sense if it's coming through from behind, just as long as it's not on the dog's face and any sort of forward-facing fur. Okay, so I'm going to turn that overlay off, and then I'm going to turn the adjustment off and on again. Yeah, I think that looks pretty nice and sunshiny. Okay, so that is one way to do it. Now I'm going to take the virtual copy into Photoshop, and I'm going to show you a different way of achieving the same thing. So here we are in Photoshop. I'm going to show you how to create the same effect in a completely different way. So in the layers palette over on the right here, I'm going to click this little icon to add an adjustment layer. And instead of doing a levels or a curves or an exposure adjustment, I'm going to select the second one down, which says gradient. Now this brings up a gradient fill dialog box here. So we want to change it to a radial. We want to make it a little bit bigger. So take the scale up, not too far. So we want to get it about the same size as the radial adjustment that we made in Lightroom. So that looks pretty good. So to adjust the actual colors of the gradient, I'm going to click that little gradient swatch, and I'm going to change this from black to, it's actually a dark gray, to kind of a really light orangey yellow sort of color. So maybe something like that. So the beauty of this, we can go in and fiddle with it later if it's not exactly right. So I'm going to go OK, and then OK on the gradient editor. I don't want to align it with a layer. I want to be able to move it around. So I'm going to untick align with layer, and then I'm going to click OK. Now, we don't want it in the middle of the dog's face. We want it over in that right-hand corner. So you can't actually click and move it without actually being in that dialog box. So I'm going to double click on that layer again, and then I'm going to click and drag, and now I can move that around to where I want it. So I'm going to place it over about kind of here. And then we're going to change the blending mode, and that's going to give us that hazy effect that we're chasing. So let's try screen. I think screen's going to be a nice one. So what do we think? That's done a pretty good job. Now we do need to sort of make sure it's not spilling over onto the dog. So I'm just going to turn that off and on a couple of times. It is spilling over a little bit, and all I'm going to do, because this gradient comes with a mask, a white mask, so you can see all of the effect initially, I'm actually going to use that mask. I'm going to select it. I'm going to switch to the brush tool by pressing B on the keyboard. And I'm going to make sure it's a black brush. So over in the swatches palette, I just reverse the foreground and background color to turn it into a black brush, from a white brush. I'm going to make it kind of big, zoom in so I can see what I'm doing. And I'm just going to brush into that mask over the corner of the dog's face and the dog's ear here, where that effect could be spilling over. So I think that sort of blocked that off pretty nicely. It's got a bit of a soft edge. You could also do a select subject and then a fill on that layer to get a really exact selection, but I don't think we need to do that here. So what if I then decided that that gradient that I created wasn't big enough and I wanted to make it a bit bigger? So that's the beauty of these layers. You can then go in and move it around. So before I do that, I'm just going to unlink the mask and the effect so that I can move the effect and keep the mask in the same spot. So let me click the little link there to unlink those. And then I'm going to double click on the gradient fill to bring the dialog box up. And I'm going to scale that up a little bit. Too much. How about there? Alrighty. And position wise, have I got it right? Is it in the right spot? I'm just moving it around to see. I think that's about right. And then I'm going to click OK. So now I actually have this effect taking up more of that right hand side, and that's probably a little bit more similar to what we've got in the effect that we did using the radial adjustment tool in Lightroom. I'm just going to save this file as it is, and then I'm going to hop back into Lightroom and compare those two different techniques. So here we are back in Lightroom. I've got 3 different versions here. To start with, I have the version that has all the basic global adjustments that we made in Lightroom, but doesn't have any sort of flare effect over on the right hand side there. Then we've got the flare effect that we did in Lightroom using the radial adjustment tool. And then we've got the flare effect that we did in Photoshop using the gradient and then the blend mode, the screen blend mode. So let's put these 2 images next to each other. So on the left, we have the Lightroom version, and then on the right, we have the Photoshop version. So I'm kind of really keen to know whether you prefer the Lightroom version or the Photoshop version, or whether perhaps you don't like either of them and would prefer the image as is, like it is on the right here. I've just changed those around. So post in the comments, let me know what you think. Personally, personal preference, it's a really hard choice. In a way, I think the Photoshop version probably has the more natural of the 2 techniques because that area has been allowed to blow out completely. So there's no detail and there's really bright highlights and it looks a bit more natural. Whereas in the Lightroom version, I kind of took the highlights down over there, and I also perhaps made the tint a little bit too pink. I really like these tones in the corner here, but I'm thinking perhaps that this one probably looks a little bit more like actual camera flare. Also, to be honest, I quite like this version too. I really like having that colored wall in the background. It's really hard. I'm undecided. Help me. Let me know what you think. What I'm going to do in the meantime is take this version without the flare into Photoshop so I can remove all the distractions. I'm going to do that as a speed edit because why not? They're lots of fun to watch. And at the end, I'm going to show you both images with all the distractions and cleanups done with the 2 different flare effects so you can compare them and let me know what you think. I hope you've learned some new techniques through this and learned a couple of different ways of doing things. There's always so many different ways of achieving the same thing using Photoshop or maybe using Lightroom or a combination of the 2. There's no correct way. It's whatever works for you. So my aim with these tutorials is really just to give you guys the tools so you can put them in your toolbox, get them out, sharpen them, hone them, use them in different ways, work out which tools you like best. And in the end, you're going to end up with a workflow and using techniques that really work for you. And that's the most important thing. Hope this has been helpful, and I'll catch you next time.